Okay. Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the October 2024 DAS meeting. So I'd like to bring this meeting to order and let's get started. Do we have any new members or people that are interested that'd like to introduce yourself? Yeah, we can turn this way. Yes, we are.
Don May, retired.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Welcome.
The other, yeah.
Bob Unger, semi-retired.
Wonderful. Very nice. Any other new members? Any other people that are excited to join us tonight? Wonderful. All right, so we have a couple of announcements, but I'd like to keep it very short just so that we can get to our exciting main speaker, John Conrad, who's going to tell us all sorts of exciting things about spaceships. So first thing we have is our announcement about dues. Bob?
Okay, we've begun collecting dues for 2025. The dues remain $30. Hopefully everyone got an email from me a couple of days ago telling you all the different ways that you can pay your dues. There's a couple PayPal methods with or without a PayPal account. One of them will let you pay with just a credit card. You can mail me a check or money order or cash, whatever. That's an option, and or any of the general meetings or the workshop meetings. You give $30 to any of the officers, and they'll get the money to pay too. So there's a lot of different ways to pay. The sooner you pay, the less reminders you get from me. So that's the advantage of paying early. But I appreciate it. We got about 30 people already signed up for, and want to keep it going. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Lynn King, tell us about the calendars.
Oh, okay. For those of you, the calendars are in, and I have them. $7. I've got your calendar. Hopefully, I won't lose it this time.
You have any spares,
Okay.
Lynn?
Pardon?
Do you have any spares?
I might. I might. I have to wait till it goes all through. Okay.
Okay.
I think I ordered 2 extra.
Wonderful.
So
I'm good.
Cool.
Huh?
Very good.
I can get one as well.
an extra one.
Yeah.
Well, let's wait. Okay. Let's wait till the next meeting and see how many people I count what I got and everything else. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. And I hope everybody has gotten a chance to get outside. We had some very exciting things happening in the last week or so. Of course, we had that lovely aurora on Thursday night. I watched it for several hours. And then just now we've got a comet going on. And I watched that for almost an hour last night. And Greg is going to tell us more about observing it.
Okay, we've got good connections with Brandywine Creek State Park, where we saw the aurora just a couple of days ago. We were watching early for the comet up there. Didn't get it from there, but now it's high enough that we could easily. So we're invited to go. We have good relationship with the park in Brandywine Creek from Hawkwatch Hill. Nice open, wide open western horizon there. Not Brandywine State Park, but Brandywine Creek State Park.
Right.
So get your B's right. The other place that we have a good relationship that we've been to before is New Garden Township. Thank you. The New Garden Township Park, right behind the township building that's up on a hill there. We were there years ago for lunar eclipse and the transit of Venus. So they have, they're willing to have us come back again. All we need to do with either of these places is just let them know the day of that some people are going to be there, and we're welcome to come and observe either site. So we can be at both sites. You know, people closer to one or the other can go to both. Watch the groups.io, and there'll be some more details in the next day or two.
All right. Thank you very much. And Mary?
DAS members are cordially invited to attend the October DAS Book Club meeting via Zoom. It will be held on October 24th at 7 p.m. We will be discussing a monograph written by Dr. Rosalind Frank, an ethno-astronomer, on the subject of Lenape Indian sky lore. The Lenape were Delaware's first visual astronomers. You and your guests are welcome to attend. If you have any questions, email librarian@telastro.org. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Do we have any other announcements that I missed? All right, great. So we're going to get started. John, if you want to come up. John Conrad, our local NASA ambassador, is going to tell us all about spaceships for the 21st century. I need to view the desktop. Where's the share button? There it is. Yep. There we go. Make that bigger for you. And I'll video you. Let me pin. No. We need to get into. Here we are. Here we are down here.
I don't do mouses. Does this mouse even work?
Yeah,
there
it's
it is.
moving.
Okay. I abandoned the mouses.
If you need, I can move it.
Mid-90s.
There you go.
Here we are.
There you go.
Okay, here we are. Here we go.
Perfect.
All right. Good to see you all. And I have to say, it's really good to see you all. I've done probably half a dozen Zoom talks since we all learned how to Zoom 4 years ago. And talking to a screen with no feedback for an hour or more, where at some point you're wondering, I wonder if there's any connection. I wonder if anybody's even there anymore. It's kind of a strange experience. And the Q&A is never as good. So I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate all you being here. And you've all heard the title here. One of my favorite topics. I think most of you know that I was involved actually directly with Rocketships in the first decade of the space age, and that was really kind of fun for a young guy. And so I've kept up with them since. And I imagine we've all noticed that space has been more in the news in the last decade, say, and especially in the last half dozen years. And so I've kept up with it, and I've been kind of really struck at how things have accelerated. And so I decided I'd dig deep into it and come up with my own view of what's going on right now. So as you've heard, this is the title. And it's a long talk. I wish it was, SpaceX and the Three Little Bears, or something like that, but it actually turns out there are 7 companies, and I'm aiming only at the US, other than SpaceX, that are really viable players right now. I chose not to make it a global thing because that's just too hard with the different variety of rockets in China and elsewhere. So it's US only. And I gave top billing Snow White there as SpaceX, of course. And in no way would NASA ever do that. So we'll get rid of the NASA logo. This is absolutely my opinion. Okay. I have no doubt about that. And the name, maybe it's a little clever, but it's not mine. Some of you look like you may have been around almost as long as me. Back in the 70s and the 60s, there was another technology that had taken off called computers. And there was this huge presence, sort of like SpaceX is today, called IBM. And so alongside IBM in the press, they found that there was Burroughs, which is right here from Paoli, UNIVAC, NCR, CDC, Honeywell, RCA, and GE. That works out to 7. So somebody came up with IBM and the 7 dwarfs, and it kind of stuck in my head. So it seemed to make sense again. And like I say, the math worked too. Now, I joined GE in the 70s, and they at that point had left the computer industry like RCA had. So then it was Burroughs, UNIVAC, NCR, CDC, and Honeywell for the bunch, the UNCH, which was easy to remember. So that was also in the press, IBM and the bunch, and digital equipment came along. And so now it was DE. So you had IBM and the bunch, like the Bears and the Bulls. Okay, so that was the background for where the name came from. So I thought, as always, to set some context for what we're going to talk about here. And I've got lots of slides on this, but I have boiled them all down into one. And so let's just compare where we were last century to this century, where the last century, of course, had about a half a century of a space age. And so let's look at how things started. And we'll use just one graphic here. And this graphic is kind of the be all and end all for what the actual market for launches was, because it's the total number around the world by year. And so lo and behold, as you may or may not remember, if you were around then, there was a huge growth in the first decade of the space age, starting with this little bump over here in the year 1957 for 2 launches, neither of which was the US. Both were Sputniks. So they did it twice before we did it at all. But then you can see that our space capabilities, along with theirs, grew very rapidly up to that level approaching 150 launches a year. And then there was kind of a plateau for 20 or 25 years. And then there's this dip over here, this bathtub. And if you think for a minute, you can see why it started. 1991 was the year when the Soviet Union went away, who had been, along with us, the principal launch country. And so the Russians have never been even close to the same level that they were as the Soviet Union. And of course, the internet technologies and the information technology took off. So other things happened for about 20, 25 years there, until about 10 years ago, things took off again. And so that's what we're doing now. Each year, we're jumping over the previous year's record. And so you're not mistaken. What you sense is happening is happening. Things are really moving up. 250 launches this year, probably, much better than just 4 a week, maybe 5 a week. And so that's what we've got going on today. So as you can see, the market is different to get things into orbit, and the launch industry has responded to that. So now let's look at what US companies are doing all this now, because it turns out we're dominant. And as I mentioned, we've got a Snow White. And I thought about this. I'm not gonna, there's a headline that frankly, probably most of you already know, but it's kind of clear why they get to be Snow White when you consider that I think 8 days ago, they launched Falcon 9 of a European spacecraft back to where DART impacted Dimorphos, the asteroid. Over the weekend, I imagine we all got a chance to see them catch their booster. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yesterday, they launched a Falcon Heavy, which most other countries, let alone companies, can't match in terms of lift capability. And it's not even their big one. And that was the Europa Clipper launch. So in an 8-day time period, they did that. I mean, they just keep leapfrogging their own accomplishments at this point. And we'll talk about them, and we'll talk about this for a few minutes. And then we got these guys. And obviously, some of them are much, much bigger than dwarves. So that doesn't actually work. And I thought for a minute about which one I could call Dopey or Sleepy, and I decided to forget about it. So we're just talking about the other rocket ship companies. Let me get this out of the way here. Yeah, there we go. And it turns out that there are 7, and they sort nicely into these 3 categories that I made up. The first one you can, guess quite easily, and what I've done now, I'm not sure.
Maybe click on the screen.
No, it should be. I mean, nothing's changed here.
Yeah, I was saying, because maybe you clicked on that. Maybe if you click on the PowerPoint, we'll bring the focus back.
I'm just trying to make it change.
Yeah, so I'm saying click on the PowerPoint, just click somewhere on it. It'll bring the focus back to it. And then you'll be able to continue.
Okay. So the old space guys, you recognize them, although ULA is a couple big other companies by the 21st century name, but it's still an old space company. And they all have lots and lots of experience. All those launches that you saw in the last half of the 20th century, the majority of the US ones were accomplished by these companies. And you understand that in the 90s, we kind of finished the consolidation of the aerospace industry. So tucked into Boeing and Lockheed Martin and companies like that are literally a dozen or two companies that were involved with names like Convair and Douglas and so on. So that's great. We've got these old companies that are still active. They have order books. They have a disadvantage, which is that while they've got all kinds of infrastructure that they build up, infrastructure is a problem when you're bidding competitively these days because you can't change over to new technologies. You're slower, there's lots of inertia. So it's quite a bit of baggage. So they aren't all that active at this point. The new space companies, like the billionaire that did SpaceX, we've got a couple more rocket billionaires here. And there are a bunch of books out there about this, and I recommend that you read one at some time if you're interested in this, because the story of how SpaceX came to be is a pretty extraordinary one. And I'm sure the same is true of Blue Origin and so on. In general, they aren't yet profitable, and they have some old technologies, but they've been able to adopt a lot of new technologies, and they've come up with some new places in the market that they're trying to hit, like space tourism. And then finally, we've got what I call the sort of lower slice of affordability in the market, which is served by companies with smaller rockets. And these happen to be the two that are left standing at this point, that are active with successful and ongoing launch programs in the US, and we'll talk about each of them. And they they were invented, frankly, to aim at what's now become not just thousands, but tens of thousands of low Earth orbiting spacecraft called nanosats and CubeSats and small sats and things like that. So the people that didn't have the size budgets that governments do, like university research groups and schools and companies, research departments, can afford to send up their CubeSats. And that's exactly where these companies have aimed in the market. So now let's start off, and you may or may not know that SpaceX actually has a longer name, and there it is. And they came along as a private company founded by good old Elon Musk 22 years ago now. And remarkably have that kind of revenue stream and market value. And these numbers are a couple of years old. It's quite a bit higher, actually, at this point. To achieve a market value of $200 billion is not just rarely done. It's almost never done by an aerospace company. But there you have it. It's a very, very valuable company. And I read recently that Musk's company now is the most valuable private company ever in terms of market value. Normally I would step through these, but I want to save a little time. But the word first occurs over and over and over again there. It took a while. It took about half a dozen years for Musk's team to finally have a successful orbital launch of the Falcon 1, which is their standard booster now, with only one of the engines that they developed, the Merlin engine. And they had a number of failures. And as it says there, Musk was almost broke. And so I just want to note that he was down to his last 30 million, I read. So if I'm ever up to 30 million, I don't want you to think of me as being almost broke. But for him, it was. At any rate, they succeeded, and sort of the rest is history. Within literally 2 years, they put 9 of those engines in the boat tail of the booster, and they had the first successful Falcon 9 orbital. And then they, in rapid succession, did some things that we didn't expect, like coming back to the launch site and landing vertically, which I didn't think I'd ever see. But it was, I felt like a kid again watching that. And then came the whole point of that, which was a reuse of these boosters, which completely changes the cost of launching, which gives a complete edge to a company that can do this because of reusability. And they do it on land, they do it on drone ships. I'm sure we've all seen that. And then they strap 3 of these things together for a grand total of 27 engines at liftoff. And there you see on the left, the first of the Falcon Heavy launches, where after, I think it's about 3 minutes, the 2 outer boosters are finished and they are deployed. And in that right-hand picture, and again, I remember seeing this in real time and just kind of sitting there cheering by myself to watch 2 of these come down simultaneously next to each other like that was just fantastic. One of the things SpaceX has done is they have been completely transparent. Everything's been done in the public eye. They offer you live video feeds for all these things. You get to see their workforce standing there cheering for themselves, basically, and you kind of feel the excitement. They've just been an extraordinary story. Then they did something that we can all be thankful for, because for about 10 years after shuttle, we'd had to rely on the Russians to put our people up in space. And so they not only were delivering the Dragon capsule to the space station with cargo, but now they'd outfitted it with 4 seats, and they had the first of the tests of that in 2020. And so we were back in the crew delivery game. And again, this has now happened over and over again. There you see the astronauts inside, and you see the fact that just recently, what is that? That's a couple weeks ago, was the 9th time that they've sent a crew up to the space station. And of course, each time they bring 4 people back as well. And notably, this last time only had 2 seats filled because there are 2 astronauts extra up there that have to come home. And we'll finish that story in a minute. But the capsules, like the boosters, are reusable, so we're saving money there. And again, the cost equation that they're able to price their offerings with is a very great amount less than what the Russians have been charging us, and even less than what Boeing, if they have their crew capability, is going to be able to deliver astronauts to orbit for. So again, they've got a cost advantage here for crew delivery. And so in summary, or not really in summary so much as to sort of put a pin in where they've gotten to, last year they had 96 launches, which has not been approached by any single company since the Soviet Union did it with Soyuz some 40 to 50 years ago, because they were doing that sort of thing back then. But they did set a record with this. But the really remarkable thing was 87 of them were reused boosters. And to not throw away that giant expensive thing is such a cost advantage that you get down to a low dollar per mass to orbit that allows them to compete with those companies that had already aimed at being very affordable for the people with small budgets, which now SpaceX is competing in that market as well. And frankly, in terms of numbers, they're winning. One particular launch in April sort of was an exemplar, I thought. That particular Falcon 9 was the 20th time it had been launched. And in those 20 launches, they put 550 spacecraft into orbit and 8 astronauts to boot.
Wow.
And so we've got, the game has changed. It's hard to find any technology that's had a game change like this reusability is in the rocket ship market. All right, now, of course, the latest chapter and the big one. And this mission statement for Starship is, if you watch any of the Musk videos standing in front of the different pieces, is kind of his vision. he's never talked about Starship without talking about Mars. And if you let him go on for half an hour, he'll be talking about colonizing Mars within the next 20 years. So he's got these visions. I guess we'll all see about that. But the fact is, that's a large reason why they got started on this in the first place, wasn't just to get to the moon and have a really heavy lift capability, but to be able to get beyond the moon. As we know, this is a giant vehicle. It's so tall that standing there, it doesn't look as big as you might think that silver first stage is, which is about a 25-story building standing there with a 15-story building on top of it. And so this 40-story building weighing many, many millions of pounds at liftoff is lifted off by the first stage, which is known as the Super Heavy. And the engines, again, developed by SpaceX, are at about 3 times the thrust of the Merlins were, these Raptors. They, for the first time, are using not just the good old liquid oxidizer of LOX, but the most energetic of the fuels now, beyond kerosene and hydrogen, is liquid methane. So they call it methalox. They have a new stage propulsion, stage combustion approach. And so basically, they have a 500,000 pound thrust engine here, like the space shuttle engines were, developed back in the 70s and 80s, except that they're much more efficient. And so that's the Raptor engines, and count them, there are 33 of them firing at liftoff for a liftoff thrust that's about 25% more than twice the Saturn V. It's just an incredible, powerful rocket. And I thought it was kind of interesting to toss in this picture of those 33 engines. The 20 on the outside are fixed. The 13 on the inside, with a ring of 10 with 3 in the middle, are all gimbaled. And so when you watch it steer itself down, you can appreciate that those are the ones that are firing at that point to change your thrust vector. And so not only is it the largest rocket ever, but the most powerful ever by a long shot at this point. The upper stage, which is officially called the Starship, not the whole thing, but the upper stage is the second stage that takes it into orbit, and it has 6 of those Raptor engines. So we've gotten to watch this up close and personal each and every time they've tried things, and their approach is one that kind of strikes me like rapid prototyping, if a lot of you remember that from the 80s and 90s, on steroids, basically. It's, it's a way to decide to not quite finish things or be not sure if they're all going to work, but go ahead and do it and be happy for the things that worked and learn from the things that didn't. So they did it for the first time just 1.5 years ago. Not all the engines fired, but I think 28 of them did. It was pretty spectacular to watch. And then there was a gap. And the gap wasn't because of the problems they couldn't fix on the spacecraft. It was because they have this agency called the Federal Aviation Administration that has to approve each launch before they can do it. That's been in the news lately. But the FAA didn't want to approve the second one until they fixed a really big problem, which was they hadn't designed their launch mount in South Texas to be strong enough. And so they literally blew pieces of concrete 1 mile or more away. And it was a bit dangerous. They rebuilt the launch mount, redesigned it, rebuilt it, put in a water suppression system that is just giant now. And they finally got approval. They finally flew. And this time, the first stage was just beautiful. Everything was nominal. The next one was only 4 months later. That time, both stages were nominal, but neither of them came back in the way that they wanted, vertically into the ocean in the case of the Super Heavy, and re-entering properly for the upper stage. And then in the 4th test flight, it went further and faster and performed nominally in every way. And yet there was more to do. And so, and they did have good controlled ocean landings, but they really didn't want an ocean landing, did they? They wanted to bring that first stage back on land. And so now we're going to take a look here at what happened on Sunday. Sunday?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
This is just the highlights for a couple months. Now remember, a 40-story building, which is miles high after about half a minute. People are pitching that range.
Staging's gonna be the next thing coming
now
out.
we're-
First, we're gonna see the.
Now we're
boosters
looking
engines
from the
start to
nose
shut down.
back toward the 33 engines,
The three.
and those fins are on the top of super heavy.
That I may have to cut off, because three are gonna keep going.
So at 2
And
minutes,
then we're gonna see the engines.
they're now going about Mach 4.
One of the most gorgeous things I've ever seen in my entire life, coming up on hot staging next. Cut off.
So basically, the upper stage flies away.
Stage separation confirmed. Ship under its own power. I'm seeing 6 out of 6 Raptors lit. Hopefully I got a booster on
The
the way
little
back
graphic
to me.
here
I'm gonna
shows
send
you the
you
orientation.
Hawthorne.
We're over 50 miles high now with the booster.
And we did hear that the tower is good for catch, so that was one of the big criteria we were looking for.
I don't know why the blue things are blocking it.
5 minutes ago.
So now we're through the atmosphere. We're still at about
Confirm. The command was sent.
6 times. So we're about 40 miles high here. Still going Mach 3.
It's pretty much right overhead of us, and we can see it starting to come down. 3 phases, we're in there, 13 engines, follow that velocity. We can see it coming down through the plume.
About 5 miles high here. Much lower than an airliner. Still going Mach 1.
You can see how fast the vehicle is moving on the level.
You see the 13 engines lit in the center there.
You're down to 3 Raptor engines.
So thrust equals weight right there. And the chopsticks close. Unreal.
Just caught a booster.
I think we'll skip the rest of it.
How much methane did it use up?
Good question. I don't know.
Why methane?
I don't know. Meth,
Because he's, being a chemist, kerosene has more carbon bonds than methane. I thought it would have more BTU.
my goodness. Is this a room full of chemists now?
Thank you.
Chemists and engineers, so.
Thank you.
You're asking the wrong person. Maybe somebody has an answer to that. But what the popular press, like Aviation Week, says is what I said, which is that the liquid methane is a more energetic source,
Okay.
for mass than liquid hydrogen. Yeah.
But then, how dense, when you condense it, specific gravity, you get more.
So now we'll go back to Falcon 9 just to kind of finish up SpaceX. You may remember from our DART talk that at that time, 2 years ago, we said the Europeans were going to design because they hadn't even finished developing their spacecraft, and I kind of wondered if they would. They did, and the Hera European spacecraft is on its way now to Dimorphos, and that little artist concept there that shows Hera and the two CubeSats arriving to basically do a crime scene investigation of where we slammed into it, 2 years ago now. And so that is, I'm really looking forward to seeing what we learned. We know that the momentum transfer was more than we'd hoped for, which is exactly what we wanted because it was a kinetic impact test to deflect an asteroid. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what we learn about the composition of this asteroid and what actually took place in the impact. And that's coming up in about 2 years. And so as of that, just a week ago, the scorecard for SpaceX for the year is that was the 23rd flight of the particular booster that just took off with Hera, the 379th flight of Falcon 9. And remember, the first successful one, I think, was in, I'm going to say 2012. So that's a pretty remarkable feat there in about 12 years to have that many launches. The 94th one this year, and the 98th SpaceX launch this year. And if you just count back 365 days, they've had 120 launches in a calendar year, which is, I don't know if there are any golfers, it's kind of like the Tiger Slam. It wasn't in any particular year, but they got them all in a row for 365 days. Nobody's ever achieved that. So it's just a remarkable track record they have. And put it in the context at this point in the year of the rest of the world. And the blue there, and this is a global pie chart. The blue is the US. So we're really doing great. The Chinese then, and then in decreasing order, Russia, India, and Japan there. So the dominant players are the two of us with China, but we're by far the dominant one. 183 so far, which means we're on track not only to break last year's record, but by about whatever that is, a little over 10%. But the interesting thing is that 7 out of 8 of the US launches have been SpaceX. And we're about to talk about the other 7 companies. And more than half of the world's launches have been SpaceX. And that's the definition of dominance. So now we're on to the first of the dwarves, if you will. And Boeing, of course, is anything but a dwarf. William Boeing started them over 100 years ago. And you may or may not know, but all these companies came from the man being able to fly, basically. They were all aircraft pioneers. William Boeing, Lockheed Martin, a guy named Vultee, Convair, which was Consolidated Vultee Aircraft, a guy named Vultee, another one named Northrop, another one named Grumman, another 2 named the Wright brothers. I mean, they all started their own aircraft companies before the Second World War. And then the space age started, and almost all of them just followed the market and became aerospace companies. And then by the end of the century, most of them had consolidated into much bigger groups where they merged a lot of the original companies. So that's the beginning of Boeing. And in the last century, any idea
What happened? I don't know.
nothing's going
Is it on the screen?
Here, it's back.
Okay, let's try that again. So in the last century, they had the Apollo 5 first stage with the huge Saturn I engines there. And they also had the Space Shuttle Orbiter because they acquired Rockwell, who was actually the prime contractor. So they had some very big roles in launch vehicles. In this century, they've got a huge role. And so you see the role they have there at the top there, Space Launch System. They're the integrator, the prime contractor, and the core vehicle prime. And if there is a more boring name for a giant rocket than Space Launch System, I'd like to know what it is. I mean, we've had Atlases, Thors, Starships, and all manner of things, and now we got the Space Launch System. But that's what they decided to call it. That's the official name. And the non-rocket roles that Boeing's had are very big also. Prime for the space station. They are one of the builders of a human landing system to take the astronauts down to the surface from lunar orbit. And as you see there at the right, they've got this second US crew capability called the Starliner, which they got the award at the same time as SpaceX. And then they had literally years of failures trying to fix things, including software. And they finally did have the successful launch of the Starliner on the last of the Atlas vehicles in June. And the astronauts, the two of them, went up to the space station to stay for a week or two, and they're still there. And so it didn't actually work out too well. And so you see this grim group of NASA officials with Bill Nelson there on the left at the press conference where they announced that they decided that there was too much risk to bring the astronauts back on their own Starliner capsule, and that therefore they were going to bring it home. They did bring it home. It performed perfectly. And of course, all the Boeing people are grousing about the fact that they didn't think they should leave the astronauts there. But at any rate, it's still not clear when Boeing is going to get this Starliner fully certified as a backup, because we really do need a backup. This giant rocket ship, when it was contracted, was to be the most powerful ever. Of course, that was before Starship was even mentioned. And what you have there in the orange is the Boeing piece, the core vehicle, with its liquid fueled engines. And on the side, you have the two strap-on solid rocket boosters. And so the engines for the booster, or the main core vehicle, as well as the solid rocket boosters, are all part of the space shuttle technology. Now, they've been upgraded, I'm sure, but basically it was for risk reduction. And still we've had years and years of delays and cost overruns. The top part of the vehicle is Lockheed Martin's, the upper stage, and the Orion crew capsule. So they finally got their first successful launch, more powerful by quite a bit than the Saturn V. In 2022, at the time, it was the most powerful rocket ever, until about a year later when Starship started to fly. It flew the capsule, but it wasn't manned, and so it went past the moon and came back. And so now we're waiting for the next event, which is Artemis II, scheduled maybe by the end of next year. And there's an artist concept of the trajectory where it goes out, I believe, on the green and goes further beyond the moon than man has gone with crew in the Orion capsule, but it doesn't go down to the moon. It just comes back on the blue trajectory and lands safely. And we've proven out that part of the crew capability. And then about a year after that, maybe as early as a little more than 2 years from now, they're scheduling the moon landing, which we'll look at in just a minute. And that's sort of the main event, obviously. And then NASA's actually contracted with Boeing and the other contractors for Artemis 4 through 8, all to be moon landings. We'll
Does
see.
the moon lander exist at this point?
We'll see. Next point. There are big questions, okay? But the biggest one is this one. They've spent well over $100 billion on the program already. It's been behind schedule pretty much every year. The NASA Inspector General, in his last several annual reports, has recommended to NASA management that they cancel Boeing's contract and find another way to do this. And Boeing's NASA management so far has resisted this. And if you read, I don't know if anybody reads Aviation Week like I do, but that's where to read about the space programs. The space editor, Irene Klotz, just in the latest issue that came out online today, interviewed Bill Nelson and asked the questions about this. And so it's interesting to hear his responses to it. My own response is, I forget who the Mississippi or Louisiana senator was, who's got the Michoud facility. I guess that's Louisiana. Stennis? It wasn't Stennis. No, Kennedy's the current one. This was the one that retired maybe 5 years ago. Doesn't matter. But he was the chief guy that kept pushing this thing because nobody wants it to die. When I say nobody, I mean probably at least half the states have got suppliers and subcontractors in this program with representatives that don't want to lose the jobs. I mean, this is a political, I said it was my opinions. This is based on standing there based on politics. Congress recently told NASA to go find more customers for this because each of those repeated Artemis missions with the SLS rocket is multiple $billion each time, way more expensive than they believe other people could do it for, not mentioning any names. The latest thing is that the NASA Inspector General, but also the Government Accounting Office, came up in August with a set of very well-documented problems having not just to do with the SLS, but having to do with the upgrades required for those Artemis 5 through or 4 through 8 missions, because they're supposed to upgrade things and change the upper stage. There's a new transporter being built. You remember these giant things that walk out to the launch sites by Bechtel. And my numbers may be a little off, but it's something like, and this was in their report, it was bid at 800 million, and now it looks like it's going to be 5.3 billion and way behind schedule. So the problems exist. Having said that, let's look at what the mission to land men and the moon is supposed to be, because when I looked into this, it's quite a bit different than what I was expecting. Some of you may know about this, but we do have the SLS with the crew on top that will at some point launch to the moon. But before that, a whole bunch of Starship launches will take place. So thank goodness that the SpaceX folks were able to catch this thing and demonstrate that it's going to be reusable, because that's just a figure of a picture there. They're expected to be a lot more than just 6 Starships required to first put an empty propellant tank in low Earth orbit, and then take propellant up and fill the tank up until there's enough propellant in low Earth orbit in that depot for the HLS Starship, Human Landing System Starship, to go up into low Earth orbit, rendezvous with the propellant depot, take on board enough propellant, go through a translunar insertion, wait in lunar orbit for the Orion to come up, transfer the crew from the Orion, take with the HLS down to the surface near the South Pole somewhere, and about 2 weeks of an exploration, and then back up into lunar orbit, transfer back to the Orion, which comes back to Earth. So there's a whole lot more moving parts here than I had realized. And most important, there's a whole lot more dependence on SpaceX, even than there is on Boeing at this point. And this is all supposed to happen a little over 2 years from now. People are skeptical. I mentioned the space editor, Irene Klotz, in her editorial in May, where she expressed her skepticism in very lengthy terms. She put in this picture and asked the question, when we get to the moon, will the taikonauts be there to greet us? The taikonauts, you may know, are the Chinese astronauts. And the Chinese have a very forthright statement of their program. They're going to be there by 2030. And they're quiet about it, but they aren't secretive. They just aren't telling us much. And they may make it. So we had a moon race in the 60s. We're going to do another one right now, actually. And we'll just see what happens. And there's more speed bumps in the road. They're not just going to launch the Starship from South Texas, but they're building more than, I believe, one launch facility at Kennedy for Starship. And the construction's been underway, but the big question there, remember, this is more than twice as powerful as the Saturn V, which launched from there. And it had a huge amount of damage when it first lifted off on the first one in Texas. So environmental impact statements have been required by not just the civilian side, FAA, but the US Space Force at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station is also doing their own review of all of the hazard areas and that sort of thing from these giant launches. And environmental impact statements, I've done them going back 50 years now, but they're not just a nuisance. They take a while because you really have to do it right. And they very often take more than a year. This is a speed bump in the road. So it's on the critical path as to whether or not we're going to get approval and full construction of those sites so that those starships that you saw there can start to launch into low Earth orbit. So there are a lot of things that have to happen here. All right, we're on to the second of the dwarves. The United Launch Alliance was the name given to the company set up by the two companies that were basically doing all of the national security launches with an inventory of old expendable boosters that had been around for a long time. And Lockheed Martin and Boeing just got tired of doing it. And so they set up a company with a management team and gave them the inventory and said, you guys do this. Now they own the company. They're joint owners of it. It's a JV. The inventory comes out of the expendable launch vehicle program. And that word expendable all the time now carries more weight because it's cost. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, there aren't many of those left. They started with the family that came from Boeing, which started way back in the 50s as an intermediate range ballistic missile. And I launched several of them in the 60s when they became the first of the two space launch vehicles. And so the Thor, which became the Delta, had most of those failures that you see there in the first 10 years. I was involved in a couple of them. And so it's got a huge track record and a very successful rate, I'd have to say, given the fact that after about 10, 12 years, almost all of them were successful. But they have none remaining. They launched the last one, I think, earlier this year, called the Delta 5, I think it was. And the other class of expendable launch vehicles began with an ICBM in the 50s, which Consolidated Vultee Aircraft, Convair, built, and then General Dynamics bought them in the 60s and so on until they eventually became part of the Lockheed Martin company by I think about the 80s or 90s. At any rate, they had a few less launches, a little lower success rate, but nonetheless, the Atlas has been very, very successful. There are 15 of them remaining. They're all accounted for in commercial launches. There aren't any more government launches coming up with that. So it's a wonderful thing to start with an inventory of 175 and after 160 not have lost any of them, but you're kind of going out of business. So there are only 15 of those original inventory left. And as you can guess, some years ago, they decided that they needed to have a new heavy lift booster, and ULA developed the Vulcan. And the Vulcan was coming along, and it has quite a few orders by the government. But unfortunately, they decided to order their engines from the Blue Origin company. And they were late, not just by months, but by years. And so they finally got delivery last year. and they put their two Blue Origin VE4 engines in. It's a very similar engine to the Raptors that the SpaceX are using. It's a very modern liquid natural gas and liquid oxygen, and they have a couple smaller solid motors on it. And so they had their first successful launch in January. The booster, or the first stage plus the upper stage, which is a version of the Centaur, which started back in the 60s also. It's now Centaur 5. They both were very good performers. And yet the astrobotic payload on top, which was supposed to then have further propulsion to take it to the moon, they had a leak and they ended up re-entering in Earth's atmosphere. So the mission wasn't successful, but the Vulcan Centaur was. And that was really important to ULA because they're waiting for approval from the Department of Defense, who has placed all the orders to be claimed to be deemed certified so that they can actually launch for the government, because at the moment they haven't been certified. They need to have 2 successful launches. They launched just last week, second time, dummy payload. It looked beautiful if you watched it. I don't know if any of you did. And then it looked odd after about 15 seconds for a little while, as one of the solid motors lost most of its nozzle. And there was this big plume, and the booster kind of went like this, and then it steered itself back. And then it turned out that the pressure vessel of the solid motor was intact. So it flew itself up into orbit. Everything happened about 20 seconds late, but it got into the exact orbit that it was planned to. So it was a successful orbit insertion, but there's a question now about that solid rocket booster that it had, which isn't made by ULA or by Blue Origin. It's made by Northrop Grumman. So these things take a while, and the certification process is underway. They've got 2 of these they're hoping to launch by the end of the year, but they need to be certified. And so it's interesting, this just was stated in the news last week, that the Space Force is saying they're going to have to switch to SpaceX for those launches if this certification can't take place. And Congress and DoD are really worried about giving this monopoly over to Elon Musk. And this was their terms, the company's unpredictable owner, which we've all had a chance to witness. I mentioned that he founded and owns the private company SpaceX. Part of the reason I sleep better is there's a really good aerospace veteran named Gwen Shotwell, who actually runs the company. She's the CEO. But we know that if you're the owner and you want to do things, you're the owner. So hopefully things will stay stable there. The third of the old space companies, Northrop Grumman, wasn't a launch company in the 90s or in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, they weren't a company until the 90s when Grumman and Northrop merged. The only one of those that actually had a rocket in the 20th century was the Grumman company, who had the LEM, the lunar module, which turned out to be extraordinarily famous as well as important for our Apollo 13 astronauts to bring them back home. But in the 20th century, they weren't a rocket ship company, and they actually weren't until 2018 when they acquired another rocket ship company, Orbital ATK, which itself was the merger of 2 20th century companies, Orbital and Alliant. And so their inventory of capabilities comes from those companies, and we'll talk about each of those. The Antares is well known to a lot of people in this part of the country for the reason that Wallops Island, which is formerly known as the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport, or MARS, is not a long drive. And so if you want to watch a launch, you can go down to Wallops Island and probably watch one of these Antares launches. There have been 18 of them in the last 12 years there. One of them was a pretty spectacular failure, I'm going to say about half a dozen years ago. I don't know if any of you paid any attention to that or not. But at any rate, unfortunately, each of those was an Antares 200 which had all Russian rocket engines in it, which the US government kept saying, you got to come up with something else. And now these days, of course, they've been told you can't use those anymore. So they had their final launch last year. They're trying to design and finish the Series 300, and they have jointly approached this with a company I'll talk about in a few minutes called Firefly, who are building a vehicle that looked like it would be very useful to Northrop Grumman as the first stage for their next Antares series. So they're scheduled for next year and the year after, and we'll see if those get there. The other parts of their inventory, this is fairly, I don't know if you call it low tech or boring. What you're looking at there is a very reliable ICBM, either Minuteman or Peacekeeper were the decommissioned ICBMs purchased by Orbital, now Northrop Grumman, so that they have a solid rocket capability of getting things up to orbit. They've been pretty successful, 39 launches since '94. And Northrop Grumman's been their owner for a couple of those. And finally, the Artemis program has this contribution from Northrop Grumman, who now own the solid rocket companies that were supporting shuttle and other programs in the 20th century. And they're those boosters that will be used for the Artemis mission. They've already been used once. So that's the story of Northrop Grumman. Now we're on to the other new space players, the rocket billionaires here. And the first you're probably all familiar with, started not in 2002 as Musk started his, but actually 2 years before that. Now, I completely missed this. I don't know if any of you were aware of this, but Jeff Bezos, when Amazon had just become something that was becoming a fairly common term and usage by most Americans, at least, he had his eyes on having a space launch company and started the Blue Origin company way back then. As a matter of fact, he hasn't been involved with Amazon for quite a while. He's done most of his work in the last few years with Blue Origin. They have revenues and a market value that unfortunately reflects the fact that they haven't been nearly as successful yet as SpaceX has been. They have quite a lot of payloads or employees and quite a big payroll. And fortunately, they've got a rocket billionaire who's put well over $5 billion of his own money into this company to get it to where it is. And they have several interesting programs, one of which is going to be critical to their future. They got started like SpaceX did with a NASA commercial contract to get them familiar with the government. And they have three different legs of their business. The first one, you're probably aware of the New Shepard reusable rocket. Yes.
I'm just gonna ask, Blue Origin, weren't they one of the original X Prize contenders along with Scaled Composites?
Probably.
And,
Probably.
Virgin Galactic and all them?
Yeah, well, the Virgin Galactic actually came out of the company Scaled Composites that succeeded. Yeah, with the billionaire we'll talk about in a minute buying them. So at any rate, so the New Shepard takes its name from the fact that the very first US guy that flew in space didn't go into orbit. He just was a suborbital flyer, Alan Shepard. And so they named their suborbital vehicle the New Shepard. And it turns out that after the test flights, they actually had some successful flights by 2015. And there you see the vertical liftoff in Texas with the crew capsule on top, with no people, just a wonderful dummy named Mannequin Skywalker, one of my favorite names. And just like the Falcon 9, the landing legs deploy as it comes back down on the launch site, and it lands vertically and it's reused. And the capsule comes down under chutes until it gets literally to the ground. And there's a great puff of compressed gas, and it cushions the landing. But if you ever watch one of these land, you think this time they're about to slam into the ground. But there's a cloud of dust and the smiling astronauts get out. Excuse me, they call them astronauts. I will not do that. The smiling passengers get out. So the first crewed flight, and I give credit to Bezos for this, he actually was one of the ones that went on board for the first time they used it to fly people. And we got to witness that 3 years ago. They've had 5 space tourism missions in those years, including good old, what's his name, Bill Shatner, at the age of about 90, who now, having finally actually gone into space, won't stop talking about it. It was just a life-changing experience, he says. At any rate, these folks are really excited about this. They paused in 2022 because they had an unmanned failure, but they restarted this year and had 2 flights. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm not sure what their price tag is. They haven't been quite as open as the next company has about that. But at any rate, they have stopped flying for the moment. They have an upgraded version of the New Shepard first stage there. And they were supposed to test it last week, and now it's been postponed a couple times for some reason. So it'll be interesting to see when they get back to that. Now, this is a company that's decided to make a splash and be public and support the public with space tourism here. But the real thing that Bezos, who is a good businessman, I think, is after is doing something that actually is going to pay him back a lot, which is what's called the New Glenn. Since Glenn was the first American that went into orbit, this is their orbital rocket. It's almost as big as the Starship. It's powered by 7 of their own engines, the BE-4s. They've got a bunch of customers lined up, including themselves, because Amazon, like SpaceX, plan to have a mega constellation for communication services. And so Starlink, you're probably aware, is now over 6,000 low Earth orbiting spacecraft. I mean, this is just madness in my view, but at any rate, Amazon has a program called Kuiper that's supposed to be similar in that. The first NASA mission was planned for next month with a launch to Mars on this 2-stage vehicle that you see sitting there in the launch pad, but not actually ready for launch. This was quite a bit earlier this year. And just a note there about how much Bezos has invested in it. And to finish out their business lines, their engine development line has been successful in they've sold to ULA. They're using them themselves. And they've got quite a line, apparently, not just the BE-4, but some other blue engines as well. And it's a very successful, the BE-4 is very successful at this point. They also have some other important contracts they've won, like SpaceX building the first human landing system. The Blue Origin folks get to have one for a mission about 5 years from now. We'll see if that happens. And most important, they recently were put on the schedule of launches by the military to be part, along with SpaceX and ULA, who have flying rockets, to be able to launch national security payloads. That's really what these guys are after. That'll be when they start to get some return on their investment. But so that's contingent, obviously, on the New Glenn working. The latest is that the Mars launch got postponed. They just couldn't make the schedule to meet the orbital alignment of the planets. So they're going to have to wait at least 6 months. And they don't want to wait. So they're putting their own payload on board, and they're planning to launch next month. They've got the 2 stages out at the launch site. They haven't completed integration yet. They've hot fired the 2nd stage rockets, but not the first yet. So there are a bunch of bumps in the road potentially, but they're supposed to launch next month. And if you're interested in hearing some details, after a lot of years where Bezos was not nearly as talkative as Musk was, he did a YouTube here that just walks you through the factory and talks about every single aspect of the New Glenn manufacturing capability. It's pretty impressive stuff, actually. So it's on YouTube in the Everyday Astronaut channel. So now, the second of, or the third of the rocket billionaires, the second of the new space players is the one that Richard Branson of Virgin fame and fortune started a couple of years after Musk. And as Rob indicated, he basically bought the stuff that had won the Ansari Prize as his starting point. And they've had ups and downs in the almost decade and a half since then. They so far have started flying space tourism, so they have some actual space tourists, but they have some actual revenues, but they pale compared to the size of their workforce and the losses that they're experiencing publicly stated in each of those years. Neither Blue Origin nor SpaceX are public companies, so you don't actually get to hear other than what they're going to tell you about. So there were 25 test flights. Then the service began, and we all got a chance to see that with Richard Branson being involved just over a year ago, or in June of last year. The first stage is an air breather. It's a plane. And so the mothership is a dual fuselage aircraft that you see there on the left. That's the Eve. Hanging underneath the fuselage in the middle is the space plane, known as the Unity in that case, which is a rocket plane that's dropped and flies into near Earth space. You see the first crew there. They're all employees of Virgin Galactic, and there's Branson on the right. So like Bezos, he put himself out there. And so that happened, and that sort of inaugurated their business. They had 7 commercial flights, as you see here. They're all from this place in southern New Mexico desert that they, and I imagine the state of New Mexico, has invested heavily in, called Spaceport America. 15 minutes long, you get to go Mach 3. You're one of 4 people in that space plane, and you pay almost $500,000 for your seat. So it's a very expensive amusement park ride. At any rate, they're not astronauts, they're space tourists. The latest flight became the last flight of the Unity space plane on June 8th, because they announced after that flight that the company is going to develop their next capability and roll it out, but they've paused their tourism operations, so they have no revenues at the moment. The plan at the point that they announced it earlier this year was that this particular vehicle, which is a bigger vehicle than the Unity was, and rolled out onto the tarmac here, I'm going to say at least a year and a half or so ago, but wasn't ready to fly. And in fact, the Imagine, which they rolled out, which would carry 6, not just 4 passengers, never flew and is not going to fly. They recently announced that they are now developing the Delta class space plane and a new mothership. And the analysts, because they're a publicly traded company, are paying a lot of attention to them because they're listed on the stock market. So the recent statements that they made to the analysts in August at some kind of an investor's call, I'm sure, was, I wrote it out there, but basically that when this new space plane is flying, they will be able to turn 2 of them around such that they have a flight every 3 days, with 6 people paying $600,000 per seat for almost $500 million in revenue. And the bridge, no, I'm sorry. And if you want to buy a bridge, I've got one for you too. They also told the analysts that within 4 years after that, they'll have more planes and more carrier aircraft and up that revenue stream to $1 billion. That's what they told them. The reality is this. After the stock got onto the market, I think it went up toward, I'm going to say $300. Anyway, they had to have a 20-for-1 reverse split recently because it had gotten so small. And now I think it's at about $6. That was to keep it from being delisted from the stock exchange. So it's still listed. And they are now, we're now waiting to see what they roll out in the way of a new Delta vehicle. And I must say, there's a lot of skepticism among the investment community. Okay, we're on to finally the new space folks, the ones that aim to the lower slice of the market. And a gentleman named Peter Beck from New Zealand, he's an engineer. He was anything but a billionaire. Worked with his country to start this company called Rocket Lab down in New Zealand. What is that, 18 years ago? And he realized after quite a bit of activity for a few years and some not just attempts, but successes there in New Zealand, that the real market was in America. Surprise, surprise. They moved their headquarters to California, and they do have launch capabilities both in New Zealand, which are much more often used, and America. They've had a revenue growth that's been pretty extraordinary for a company that started pretty small. They're going to hit about $400 million this year. As you'll see in a minute, there's a lot of launches that they're doing this year. They're by far the highest quantity U.S. launch company other than SpaceX at this point. Their market value is at that level, but that's for a small startup company, about the same level as Blue Origin's investment. They've got a lot of employees. Like the other big companies, they started with a U.S. government contract to study something, and it fit what the government wanted from them, and what they wanted to do was CubeSat launches. And so they focused on that, and they've now developed one very successful launch vehicle with more on the way, and buses to deploy the small sats in orbit and the launch services at the launch sites. So their rocket, which has been very, very successful, is obviously 200 kilograms. That's less than 500 pounds to low Earth orbit, a very small lift vehicle. There it is, flying from the extreme eastern point of a peninsula in New Zealand. And they developed their own engine, used on both the first and second stages. They reached orbit in 2018 with CubeSats, and they now have a launch site also at Mars in Wallops Island called LC2. And they've had 48 successful missions since 2018, 4 of them from Wallops Island. And the NRO, among other people, are using them now because the US government customers have found that they can get a lot of bang out of very small satellites at this point too. They have, as noted there, some successful first stage ocean recoveries, and they're about to start reusing their first stages. So they're going to be able soon probably to take advantage, at least with this vehicle, of reusability to bring costs down. They had 20 launches planned this year. They've had 10 successful through the first 9 months. We'll see if they make it, but they're still on the manifest for about 10 more launches. So 20 launches this year is pretty substantial for a small startup. They are long into developing the next and bigger launch vehicle called the Neutron. They hope to roll it out by now. That's an artist concept of it. It is supposed to roll out next year. It's almost 2 orders of magnitude more powerful than the Electron. And they're focusing on that mega constellation market. So they'd be sort of a little brother to the New Glenn, if you will, aiming at the same market, but with less thrust, but lots and lots of payloads available to fly there. And they, their first stage is comparable to what the Falcon 9 was in terms of power. They're constructing their manufacturing capability for this down at Wallops Island. So they're really investing in the US, plus they're adding a launch complex down there. And maybe by the middle of next year, we'll see a launch of the Neutron. So Beck, this engineer that didn't have all that much money to start, has been very successful, for which he's been knighted. So he's now Sir Peter Beck, because New Zealand is on the map for being space power. And now the final of the dwarves, Firefly Aerospace. the startup here was only 10 years ago. Couple folks, one was a Ukrainian engineer who at the time was working for, I think it was Virgin Orbit, not Virgin Galactic. Virgin Orbit went out of business already. I think he was working for Virgin Orbit. He started it up with some other people. They had a plan to develop a rocket and fly it within 2 years. Very ambitious. Unfortunately, funny thing, not so funny thing, happened on the way to that. And I recommend the Wikipedia article on Firefly if you really want to read an exciting story about what happened to these folks. But that same guy that had come from Virgin, turned out he brought some of Virgin's intellectual property with him. And so he got sued successfully. They lost out there. They had a bunch of European investors who were losing their shirt because of Brexit. And so their money was going away and they liquidated and were reborn then with slightly different investment team and ownership, but lots of Ukrainian content. They intended to have their R&D center there and their manufacturing center there when they were born as Firefly Aerospace in 2017. And I imagine that every time they talked to the US government, they were getting a lot of this. And so slowly but surely, they decided to move their manufacturing and everything to Florida. And not just that, but in February 2022, they had been ordered to get rid of all the Ukrainian assets by the government if they wanted to keep going, and they did. This all happened before the Russian invasion, which coincidentally was in February also. So that was the story of their birth as the current company, now without any Ukrainian strings attached. And they actually did succeed in building and launching and successfully achieving orbit with the Alpha a year ago. So they have an expendable launch vehicle that's in the, low to medium class there for low Earth orbit. NASA has used them. And they've got quite a business future. And I say that because the very mature companies that you're about to see have kicked the tires there and decided that this is a place that they want to actually, contract with. And so they have 4 more missions this year, and they're claiming themselves, this is the Firefly people, that we're the folks to come to along with either SpaceX or Rocket Lab for small sats. But the fact is that SpaceX, as I mentioned, have now figured out a way to have 2 different classes of small sat launches where they launch numbers like this, 116 payloads in one launch on their Falcon 9. So they've figured out a way to use their low cost, low price to orbit and attract that part of the market. Having said that, these folks like Firefly and Rocket Lab are still pushing. Northrop Grumman has gone into partnership, as I mentioned earlier, with them for the first stage for their Antares, which is also going to be the medium launch vehicle for Firefly. And Lockheed Martin and L3 Harris have got a total of almost 50 Alpha vehicles that they've contracted for over the next 5 or 6 years here. And NASA's contracted with them for 2 lunar landers. So whatever it is that folks see when they go and visit them and look at their capabilities, apparently it's pretty substantial at this point. They plan to have a lunar lander launch next month with the Blue Ghost, the Firefly Blue Ghost. We'll see about that. And the latest thing is that the next series of polar orbiting weather satellites, which NOAA uses, has now been contracted by NASA with Firefly. So, or the Pathfinder, at least for it. So it's a pretty substantial story, given that they suffered from intellectual property theft and went out of business once, only about 7 years ago. All right, so we'll wrap it up then. As I've said, it's that huge price advantage that's made the Falcon and SpaceX be dominant, not just in the US, but the world. and Starship is gonna be the next big thing. The Russians, who once were dominant with their Soyuz, at literally dozens of launches a year, now that's ended, and for crewed launches, they're not even price competitive anymore. But these folks are coming, the Chinese in particular. The Indians are really also quite active with several different types of launch vehicles that are very reliable. And the Japanese do pretty well too. So those are kind of the other players. But the Chinese by far are the one that are pushing and having lots and lots of success. And with whom we're now in a moon race, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it, folks.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
You did a great job. Yeah. Do you have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Chemist question, what is the metal used, aluminum alloy for the outer shells of these?
Some of them have been. I mean, the Atlas is famous for that. In the early years, it was known as the aluminum balloon. And in the early years, it was nice and light, obviously, but it wouldn't stand up of its own accord if you put a heavy payload or second stage on it.
Yeah.
And so they had a few that just folded up on the launch site. And so I launched one of those. You had to either have a gantry that allowed you to loop some cables to hold the sides up, or you kept it under pressure all the time, which is what we did. So there have been aluminum ones. The Starship is stainless steel.
Stainless steel.
Yep. Anybody else?
Did you say most of the SpaceX launches are out of Texas or?
The Starship ones are only out of Texas at the moment.
Okay.
All the others are out of either Vandenberg. Vandenberg didn't get mentioned, but Vandenberg is the place where polar launches take place, and there are a lot of them still.
Where's
So Vandenberg,
that?
coastal California. If you look at the US and you want a place where you can launch over water and go into a polar orbit, the only place is where the left coast does this. And Santa Barbara is right here. You drive north past Santa Barbara at sunset, you're looking into the sun and you think, wait a minute, I thought I was going north, because you're going west. And there's the point, and that's where Vandenberg is. So you can fly to the south without going over water for 5,000 or 6,000 miles. And so it has been, since 1959, the place to launch polar satellites, which is obviously to the intelligence community very important, because you want to be able to look down on the entire world, or the earth sciences community. That's where I worked, Vandenberg. And we used to have an inferiority complex versus the Cape. Anyway, yeah, a lot of launches from there, not nearly as many as the Cape right now. And that's where Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy launch from.
Any others?
Thanks very much,
All
everybody.
right, thank you. Thank you again for coming. And I believe Diana's in the other room, so if you can join us, hope that has a good month. Thank you. Thank you for coming.